So let me start out this morning asking a simple question. Who is the wisest person that you know? Now think about it for a minute. Who is the wisest person that you know? Now I want to ask you then, what is your definition of wise? Is it age or experience or intellect? What is it that makes that person so wise that you're thinking of? And why would you admire their wisdom? Is it because they seem to be happy or at peace or they seem to be successful? Or maybe you just really respect and admire smart people. What we want to talk about in our series that's starting today, Wise, and that's the whole idea of real life Proverbs. We're going to dig into this book called Proverbs in the Bible. If you brought a Bible or you have a device that you can get Wi-Fi on, you can go to Southland Guest and then go into the Bible app and turn to Proverbs. We're going to try to unpack a lot of lessons from this book over the next 8 weeks. And I think about how people often define the word wise, and they think of it in terms of smart. Well, smart is part of wise, but wise is so much more than that. What wise means is you're discerning. In other words, you can tell the difference between real and fake, good and bad, right and wrong. I mean, all of those things are a part of a person who has wisdom. And that's what this book, Proverbs, is all about. We're going to teach ourselves how to be street smart instead of just book smart. And street smart's a good thing, and hopefully throughout this series you'll find that to be true. So today I'm going to just kick it off, sort of set the table of what we're going to be talking about over the next 8 weeks. If there is a book about street smarts, Proverbs is definitely it. And if you want to be smart and wise, you'll read it. Now let me just encourage you. You should read Proverbs every day if you want to be wise. I mean, even if you just read one of them, one little verse, there will be so much to chew on in just one verse. I think you should memorize Proverbs. Now, I'm not saying you have to memorize all 31 chapters, but memorize key Proverbs for your life. And this isn't going to be like some start to finish journey, although today we are talking about Proverbs chapter 1. We're not going to just walk through every verse, but we are going to do our best to walk through all of the main themes that the book of Proverbs addresses, and you'll get a lot of it over these next few weeks. Now, it's interesting when you look at this series. Today we're just going to talk about being wise in general, but over the next few weeks we're going to talk about knowledge and discipline and relationships and plans. Anybody make plans, or am I the only one? And your work and wealth and even your temptations. We're going to talk about all of those things and what Proverbs has to say to help us. Now, like I always do when I want to talk to you about a book or some verses, I want to put everything in context for you. So there was King David. He came along, God blessed him. He was a man after God's own heart. He brought the nation of Israel back to honoring God, and he was an absolutely prolific writer. If you open your Bible to Psalms, you'll see most of those were written by King David. King Solomon was his son, and he must have picked up some of Dad's skills, Dad's mad skills, because he's quite a writer himself. And he wrote all of Proverbs, and at least, even though he sometimes is quoting other writers or other philosophers, in it, he's the author of the book of Proverbs. And it's here that we understand what wisdom is all about. Now, if you were to open your Bible to 1 Kings, you'd find the story of Solomon. He had a dream, and God said, hey, Solomon, I'm going to give you whatever you want. What do you want? And here's what Solomon said in chapter 3, verse 9 of 1 Kings. He said, give your servant a discerning heart to govern your people and to distinguish between right and wrong. I mean, the very definition of wisdom. In other words, give me wisdom. And God was so impressed that Solomon only asked for wisdom and not for a bunch of wealth, that he gave him both wisdom and wealth and honor. He blessed him with both of those. Actually, here's one directive, though, God gave to Solomon when he handed him this wisdom. And it's a little later in 1 Kings 3, verse 14. If you walk in my ways and you obey my statutes and commands as David your father did, I will give you a long life. In other words, I'm going to bless you and your nation if you keep your eye on the ball and stay in my lane. That's what he guided Solomon with. Now, here's the thing. First 9 chapters of Proverbs is just all about what wisdom is and comparing it to something called foolishness. We'll talk about that in a little bit here. But then Proverbs 10 through 31 are where all the Proverbs really are. And you can go to those, like I say, pick up one every day. Some people, since there's 31 chapters, some people just say, you know what, whatever day of the month it is, I'm going to read that chapter of Proverbs. That's a boatload to unpack, though, if you read all of that. So I just encourage you, find a verse every day from Proverbs. He includes wisdom, and then he gives us this key principle when we start out this whole book. Look down at chapter 1, verse 7. Here's really a foundational verse for our series and our lesson today. Verse 7 says, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and discipline." Now, I don't know if you've noticed, maybe we haven't mentioned it very much, but we're building a new auditorium down at the end of the building. Did anybody notice that, or have you heard about that? Now, when you build something like that, the most important part of the construction is all of the stuff you cannot see. It's the stuff underground, and it's the foundation that you're building on. If you do that wrong, the whole thing's going to be wrong. And that's really what Proverbs is all about. It's saying, I'm going to give you a start, a beginning of what you need to build your life on so that you can put up nice walls, a good roof, great things inside of it that'll really be great for you in your life. But the question is, what is it that's the guts that we cannot see in you? What guides your purpose, your vision, your priorities, your activity? What is it that's foundational in you? In other words, here's the question. Why do you think what you think and do what you do? I mean, what is the purpose in your life? And are you just the sum of all of your upbringing and your relationships and your environment and your culture? Or is there more to you than that? Are you wise in your decisions? Or are you just reacting out of habits and experience? You see, I guess here it is, people. Here's the big question. Am I my own person, or am I just culturally conditioned to think a certain way, to believe certain things, and to act certain ways? So here's what this key verse can show you. Wisdom is built on a foundation of trust in God. Now, let me just pause and say, I'm making an assumption. I get it. I'm making an assumption that you think wisdom is actually a virtue. In other words, wisdom is a good thing. Now, if that's not your assumption, if you don't think wisdom's a good thing, man, you're going to be saying after this, that's 30 minutes that I'm never going to get back in my life, when this is over. But wisdom is a good thing. It's discerning, remember, between what is fake and what is true, what is good and what is bad, what is right and what is wrong. But maybe you care about being book smart, and today you realize, though, what you really need to be is street smart. In other words, do I know what I'm supposed to be doing with what I know? Do I know what I should be doing with what I know? That's what wisdom's all about. Why should I care if something is right or good or true? How should I decide if something is important that I should put before other things? Am I just the sum of my upbringing, or am I building my life more intentionally upon some solid foundation? Solomon makes it clear, here is where you start. Do you remember what the verse said? I'll put it up there again. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. You see, the fear of the Lord is the starting point for you to live the life He designed you to live. It's the starting point to not only having important stuff in your head, but applying that stuff to your work, your family, your marriage, your relationships, even to applying it to knowing God and who He is and what He wants for you. Now God, listen, is the foundation of all truth and morality. And to live the real life you were designed to live for, You must honor and respect the designer of your life. To be street smart, you need to know the author of truth and the author of purpose. If wisdom is discerning between right and wrong, true and fake, good and bad, then who decides what all of those things are? If you're not passionately pursuing God, you're passionately pursuing something other than wisdom. And so if wisdom's a virtue to you, you ought to find out who the author of wisdom is. It's interesting, and though here's what he said. This always throws people for a loop. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Why fear? I mean, does God want me to be afraid of him? So if you look in the original language that Solomon wrote this in Hebrew, and you look at the word fear, it's yirah. Everybody be a Hebrew scholar this morning and say it with me. Yirah. You guys are like amazing. All right. It means two things, though, actually. It means both terror and reverence. Both. So you think the fear of the Lord, being terrified of the Lord. Well, you understand his power. I mean, we're talking the God of the universe, the God who decided to snap his fingers and all of this came into being. You understand his power, which leads you to honor and respect his direction. Well, hopefully. Obey him. That's what he's saying. But you also understand his deep love for you, and it instills reverence and worship as well. I like to think of it this way. When I think of how I looked at my grandpa when I was a child. Now, my grandpa, when I was a child, was just this massive, ginormous human being. I can't think of any other big words other than how I looked at him, and it was like, like with your mouth open. He was huge to me. And as a character, he was larger than life to me. He was not only physically big and strong, but he was also extremely smart. He had a PhD. He taught in a university. He was a superintendent of schools for a couple places. And so I was just in awe of this guy. But here's the thing about my grandpa that was so amazing, is no matter how in awe I was of his power and how I felt like he could crush me in a second if he wanted to, I also knew how much he loved me because he had 21 grandchildren, and he always made by hand our Christmas gifts every year. Made them by hand. He'd go out and cut down a tree and literally build us something out of wood. Like if you go into the office here, in the main room there in the office, the coat rack in there was built by my grandfather, was one of his Christmas gifts for me. So not only did we have a certain sense of respect and terror around him, and trust me, the terror came when you didn't do what he told you to do. It just came. But we also fully understood his incredible love for us and how everything he was doing in his life was always in our best interest. So when Solomon tells us to fear the Lord, he's telling us both terror, because God could squash us like a gnat in the blink of an eye if he wanted to, but also out of reverence and worship because we know how deeply he loves us. That's what yirah means. Knowing he could crush you, knowing he's worth trusting and honoring in your life. Now, when you build your life on that kind of fear of the Lord, and I just pause again and say, what have you been building your life on? How's that going for you? What are you building your life on? Solomon's saying, I got a great idea. Build it on the fear of the Lord. And that's when you'll begin to truly understand what's true and fake, what's good and bad, what's right and wrong. But here's what's interesting is he said that's the beginning of wisdom, just the starting point. If you back up to verse 5, though, he actually tells us something else that will work as well. Look, Proverbs 1, verse 5, let the wise listen and add to their learning, and let the discerning get guidance. You see, men and women, wisdom is both knowledge and discernment. You need both. Solomon starts the proverb by saying, basically, this is why I'm writing these proverbs for you. They were intended to be a teacher to all of the people in his nation, all of the Israelites. Solomon the king was also the superintendent of schools. This was the curriculum he wanted to get across. And in verse 4, he even says these proverbs will help the simple. Now, who are the simple? That sounds kind of insulting, right? The simple were simply the people that had trouble learning. He's saying everything I'm giving you is for the wise, the discerning, and even those who have the most difficulty learning. It's for everyone. Now, in verse 5, there are two people he talks to. Did you notice it there? There's the wise and the discerning. And I'm reading this, and I'm saying to myself, wait a minute. I thought this whole book was to help me become wise and to help me become discerning, and he's talking to those who already are. Well, that's the point. Here it is again. Let the wise listen and add to their learning, and let the discerning get guidance. So in other words, if you're wise, you never stop learning. Now, more on that next week, all right? But let's be clear. Wisdom does require knowledge. In other words, you need to learn stuff. But if you're wise, you never stop learning. And discernment is making the best decision between options. If you want to be wise, you not only want to know your options, you want to be able to decide what is the best option in every situation. Probably when you were thinking, when I first started out and said, who's the wisest person that you know? It's probably a person who was so good at choosing between options. Seemed like that person always took you down the right path. Solomon is saying to us, look, here is the stuff you need to know about God, and choose what's best in your life that God will then honor. Ultimately, that's what's best for you. You keep adding to your knowledge. Now, I've told you a few times, when I first graduated from college, I went into politics, and my first job was working on a campaign. And of course, the big thing in campaigns is name recognition, so you get all of these yard signs up you can get up. Now, back in the day, let me just put it there. Back in the day, yard signs were a whole lot harder to put up than they are now. I mean, now it's a piece of wire, you throw it in the ground, throw the bag over it, that's a sign, that's all there is to it. I mean, we had to bang in these two wooden stakes. We had these waxy signs that we had to staple all together and then staple to the sign. They were huge, they were very burdensome. And there was a best way to put them up so that they would last through the weather and make it to election day. Now here's the thing. We had interns from Ivy League schools, and they would come on board, and I'd take them to put up signs. Well, first of all, just putting up signs was a little bit beneath them. But then I was teaching them, here it is, the little Bible college boy was teaching the Harvard guys how to put up a yard sign. What's wrong with this picture? They would say to themselves. And they'd say, we got it, and they wouldn't listen. And I'm not kidding you, every sign they ever put up fell down within the week. The weather blew it over, it just didn't last, they didn't do it right. All these really haughty guys who thought they were so smart couldn't put up a yard sign that worked. Why? Because they thought that they didn't have anything more to learn. I mean, I'm Harvard. What more do I have to learn? Well, in this case, Solomon's saying, no matter how wise you are, no matter how discerning you are, you can always add to your learning. What you might want to realize is that you need knowledge and humility if you're ever going to actually keep learning and becoming wise. Now, here's the thing. You might actually learn something from someone you think doesn't have your credentials, like your spouse. You might actually learn something from that person. You might actually learn something from your child or someone who works for you. You know what? Here's the amazing thing. It's possible, not likely, but it's possible you'll actually learn something from your pastor. It could happen. The whole point is the person who's wise recognizes they still have a lot to learn. I love how the New Living Translation translates this. Let the wise listen to these proverbs and become even wiser, and let those with understanding receive guidance. Now, the question is, I guess we pause here because I asked you earlier, do you even think wisdom is a virtue? I guess that's the question is, do I want to become wiser? Is that something I think is important in my life? If so, stay with me because I know you're probably saying, where is he going with this stuff anyway? All right, let's go back to the original foundational verse, verse 7. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and discipline. You know, if you read the book of Proverbs from start to finish, you'll also see that it's a warning to those who choose not to become wise and who choose not to fear the Lord. Essentially, the book is all about wisdom exposing the foolish. Wisdom exposes foolish thinking and foolish activity. Now, there are these two words that Proverbs uses more than any others. You've heard them then. Wisdom, which is used 51 times, although references to wisdom are all throughout. And the word foolish, which is used 19 times, but there's descriptions of the foolish 92 times in the book of Proverbs. Don't you love it when I bring you the stats, I know you're just jumping out of your seat like, wow, awesome. The entire book is a contrast between wisdom and foolishness. I mean, that's what it is. Just showing you, here's how a wise person thinks, here's how a fool thinks. What is a fool? Basically, it's the antithesis of a person in pursuit of God and his wisdom. It's a person who's pursuing anything else but God and his wisdom. Actually, there are different Hebrew words used throughout the book of Proverbs that are translated in English, fool or foolish, because they mean so many different things. It might be silly, it might be immoral, it might be stubborn, or it might be just plain ignorant. I wanted to use a word that we told our kids never to use, so I didn't use that word. Look at the verse again. Verse 1:7 gives a broad definition of a fool, someone who hates wisdom and discipline. Basically, the opposite of being wise is being foolish. Now, here's what you need to get today, though, and this is what I want you to know. Wisdom exposes a fool. Wise people are a light on the darkness of ignorance and immorality. It happens all the time. Now, again, we're starting a series, and I'm trying to just lay a foundation for all of us to build on, just to kind of set the table of what we'll be talking about over the next few weeks. But Solomon shows us, here it is, if you're not fearing God and his truth, his morals, his priorities for your life, you're choosing a foolish life. Now, I get it. It sounds harsh, and who are you, Mr. Judgmental, up there on the platform, who said you get to say what's wise and what's foolish? I don't. See, that's the whole point. God does. And I'm simply passionately pursuing what God tells me is wise and passionately avoiding the things he says are foolish. When you become wise, you can clearly see the flaws and failures of those who are not embracing God's design and his purpose for their life. I mean, it's so obvious to us. Now, I'm going to ask you a question. Don't raise your hand, because if you raise your hand, you'll simply be an illustration of the question. But how many enjoy being called a fool or foolish? Now, you see the point, right? Don't raise your hand, because then we're all going to look at you. But none of us like being thought of as a foolish person. And yet there aren't many among us here who have not thought or done something foolish. Now, at that point, we could all raise our hands, right? We've all done something goofy. And wisdom is not only to empower our lives to accomplish our purpose, wisdom also helps us to stop thinking dumb stuff if we'll pursue it passionately. I think back to the crazy stuff that I believed was great and important when I was in junior high school. Like wearing bib overalls with just one side attached. We thought that was so cool. Or having more than one girlfriend. I mean, that was crazy. Or that if my mom hugged me in public, I would die. You know, those are things that I thought were true and important. And yet, what I found out is that over time and as I gained wisdom, I realized that they made two straps on overalls for a purpose, and it really is a lot better. And one girlfriend was plenty to navigate when I was in junior high school. And my mom hugging me in public has actually given me better health and a good life. You know, I learned all of these things, and yet, here's the thing. Trust me, even as an adult, I have believed some foolish stuff that has had profound consequences on my life. And maybe that's the same for you. Maybe you never got out of junior high school in some ways, and you kept believing foolish stuff would actually get you where you want to go in honoring God with your life. I guess the point is this. I mean, Solomon says it very clearly. The more wisdom you have, the more you expose ignorance and immorality, the more you expose foolishness. Now, you know, I have to be honest with you. You know, I walk through these messages before we do them. And I was looking at myself saying, this is the weirdest sermon in the world. This is goofy. But it isn't, because I'm trying to lay the groundwork for what Proverbs can do in your life to make you wise. The question is, do you want to be wise? And do you want to be wise like God designed you to be wise? Am I pursuing wisdom, or am I just existing and becoming a product of my environment? I mean, am I just thinking like everybody else around me thinks? I mean, let's face it, you are being bombarded with messages all day, every day, from multiple sources. And the question is, where is it that you're going to go to filter all of that into what is true and not fake, what is good and not bad, what is right and not wrong? The Word of God. Proverbs. Now, spoiler alert, just because you're wise doesn't mean you'll always do wise things. Because here's Solomon, the wisest man in the world, the man who wrote Proverbs, and yet Solomon made some extremely foolish choices as king of the nation. And we're going to talk about that later. So today, right now, I'd like you, as you think about kicking this series off and kicking off your week, I want you to say, am I going to lay a foundation of a passionate pursuit of wisdom, or am I going to chase hard after something else? And I just want to encourage you. God is not only powerful and mighty and someone to indeed be feared, but He loves you. His grace and His mercy is immeasurable. He cares deeply about what's best for your life. And I'm here to tell you today, He's worth revering. He's worth fearing, because He wants you to be wise.